It was October 2017 when I was sent to a remote surveillance post in northern Scotland. I was 36 at the time, and I'd been working under contract with the UK government for just over 8 years, mostly quiet field operations, data gathering, and occasional support to local intelligence units when things got too strange for the police to handle cleanly. We were Crown agents, officially just consultants, but we were used when MI5 or local branches needed something off the books. No media, no paperwork trail. You just got in, handled it, and vanished. The operation was straightforward on paper. There was a property out near the Cairngorms, about 40 miles from any real town, and completely off-grid. It had once belonged to a Dutch shipping tycoon who died in the 90s, and over the years it passed hands through shell companies and obscure trusts. No one stayed long. Every owner sold it after just a few months, often for less than they'd paid. Recently, though, there had been chatter from a flagged phone number in Glasgow. Someone using an encrypted line had mentioned the cabin during a call that was otherwise filled with coded references. Our analysts flagged it. They traced the coordinates and sent me in. I was to spend 5 nights there, observe, take notes, monitor the area, and report anything unusual. That was all. Just sit in the damn place and watch. I was dropped off by an off-road vehicle and given a backpack with a satellite relay, battery packs, dried rations, bottled water, and a .38 in case things got personal. I never liked firearms, but it was regulation in isolated ops. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The roof was sagging slightly in the middle, and there were marks along the wood near the door. Claw-like scrapes, not fresh but deep. It looked like animals had tried to get in at some point. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped up and unlocked the front door. The inside smelled like damp wood, old paper, and mold. A fireplace sat dead in the far corner, blackened by old soot, and the windows were covered with thick dust. The back of the cabin had a tiny bedroom with a cot and an old metal wardrobe. I dropped my gear, pulled out my notepad, and began documenting the layout, condition, and anything notable. Day 1 was easy, but something felt wrong that first night. It wasn't something I could point to. There was no sound outside, no birds, no wind, no insects, just silence. I'd done stints in other remote parts of the UK and even a few weeks in some Scandinavian forest posts, but I'd never heard silence like this. It wasn't just quiet, it was total absence. I tried not to let it get to me. I boiled water with my small burner and logged the environment conditions. Weather steady, for degrees Celsius, slight fog at dusk. I noted the absence of wildlife. That was a red flag. Usually, you'd hear owls, small rodents, or at least leaves rustling. But here, nothing. I slept light that night, fully clothed, pistol under the pillow. On day 2, I walked the perimeter. I marked out a 200-meter radius from the cabin and took GPS readings every 20 meters. I made a full loop, and that's when I noticed it. Near the eastern edge of the property line, there were recent boot prints. Deep ones, not from hiking boots, but something heavier, possibly tactical. The spacing was wide, like the person had a long stride or was moving quickly. But they didn't go far. They stopped at the tree line, not turned around, just stopped. I stood there for a few minutes scanning with binoculars, but the woods swallowed everything past 20 feet. It was hard to tell if someone had been watching me or just passed through. I logged the coordinates and made a mental note to check the direction again later. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something moving around the side of the cabin. I had locked all the doors and covered the windows before sundown. I turned off my headlamp and pressed my back against the bedroom wall. I listened. The sound was slow, heavy steps in the gravel. Then silence. Then more steps. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy. I didn't move. I just waited. The sound circled the cabin once. Then nothing.
No footsteps retreating.
Just gone. I stayed alert until morning. When I stepped outside, The ground was too dry to catch proper tracks, but I saw it anyway. By the corner of the porch, a single small pile of moss, perfectly formed, right where I'd seen nothing the day before. I bagged it and marked it down. I was beginning to think this wasn't just a surveillance task. This was bait, and I was the hook. Day 3, I stayed inside. If someone was trying to draw me out, I wasn't going to give them what they wanted. I used the satellite relay to transmit a basic report, but the signal kept dropping. Every 2 minutes, the connection would cut, then reconnect. That didn't happen on its own. Someone was jamming the frequency or bouncing a signal off a local relay I couldn't detect. Around 5 p.m., just before sunset, I saw movement through the trees. A man, tall, in a dark parka, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. I grabbed my binoculars. He was staring dead at me, face partly covered by the hood. Then he stepped backward and disappeared into the woods. I didn't chase him. I waited, and that night I made sure the pistol was chambered. The 4th night was the worst. I was lying on the cot, trying to sleep in 30-minute cycles when I heard it. A scraping noise near the front door, then another. It went on for at least 10 minutes, then silence. I got up just before dawn, opened the door, and found the entire porch covered in fresh dirt. Not scattered, carefully poured, like someone had emptied a bucket of soil. On top of that dirt, arranged in a perfect circle, were pine needles and bits of cut string, all evenly spaced like someone had used a ruler. I took pictures, bagged a sample. Whoever was doing this knew I was watching, and they didn't care. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message, but I couldn't read it. That day, I found more boot prints, but this time 2 different sets. One smaller, probably female. They didn't approach the cabin. They stopped about 25 meters out and turned toward the trees. I was losing track of time, food, and sleep. The satellite relay stopped working entirely. Battery was full, signal bar was strong, but the connection never held. On the final night, I packed everything, left only the essentials unpacked, and kept my coat and boots on. I wasn't going to sleep. Just before midnight, I saw lights between the trees. Not flashlights, red dots, 3 of them steady, not moving. Possibly rifle scopes or laser sights. I didn't move. I sat on the floor beside the bed with my back to the wall, holding the pistol, and I waited. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the lights went off. Nothing followed. When daylight came, I left. I walked the 2 miles to the extraction point, not stopping once. I didn't look back. The pickup vehicle was late by an hour. When the driver arrived, I didn't speak. He didn't ask. 3 weeks later, I was debriefed in Edinburgh. I handed in everything, samples, notes, photos. My superior flipped through it all quietly and didn't say much. That was the last field operation I ever did. They transferred me to domestic analysis work after that. I never got an official explanation, but I heard rumors that the property was sold again, this time to an anonymous trust in Switzerland. Whatever happened out there wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be observed, and I was just part of the observation. That place, whatever it was, wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was being used, and whoever was behind it, they knew we were watching, and they didn't care. I was 31 years old when I took a week off from work to go hunting in the northern woods of Wisconsin. It was mid-November, 2018, and the weather had already started to shift into that bitter kind of cold that digs into your hands and makes your breath feel sharp. I worked construction back then, and I was burned out. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be far away from machines, people, traffic, and my phone. I wanted to be somewhere I could sit still for hours without hearing anything but trees creaking or the wind scraping through the dry brush. A buddy of mine, Dan, Had a cousin who owned a hunting cabin a few miles off a logging road near a place called Rock Elm. It was about as remote as you could get without having to hike in on foot. The cabin sat on a stretch of old timberland that had mostly been cleared out decades ago, but the surrounding woods were thick, uneven, and mostly untouched since. He gave me the key, and I drove out early on a Saturday morning with a cooler of food, a bolt-action rifle, a jug of water, and everything I needed for a quiet week alone. The cabin was simple. One small bedroom, a fireplace, a propane stove, and no running water. There was a plastic tank out back for rainwater and a rusted-out outhouse about 30 feet into the trees. It smelled like mildew inside, but it was dry and solid. The last person who had stayed there must have left months ago, judging by the way the dust had settled across the windowsills. The place was surrounded by nothing but woods and the uneven remains of old logging paths that had nearly been swallowed up by the underbrush. I spent my first day scouting around, checking the area, setting up a small ground blind about 100 yards northeast of the cabin, near a dried-up creek bed. There were old deer tracks and scat near the edge of the timberline, and some broken branches that looked fresh. I had a good feeling about the spot. It felt quiet out there. Too quiet, maybe, but it was the kind of quiet I'd been craving. The first 2 nights were calm. I woke up early each morning before the sun and sat in my blind for hours with my rifle resting across my lap, staring into the trees. I didn't see much, just squirrels, a raccoon once, and one small doe that caught my scent and bolted before I even lifted the gun. But that was fine with me. I wasn't in a rush. I liked the rhythm of it, the cold air, the stillness, the sound of birds flitting through the bare branches. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I just finished eating around 6 and had started boiling water for coffee on the stove when I heard what sounded like branches snapping out in the trees. Not the normal kind of snapping like when a small animal runs through the brush, but sharp, deliberate cracks, too slow and heavy for a deer or raccoon. I turned off the burner and stepped outside, listening. It had gotten dark already. The cold had set in hard. I stood on the small porch with my coat zipped up and my boots crunching on frost. I heard it again, crack, crack, then silence. I couldn't see anything past the edge of the tree line, but it sounded like something was circling around the cabin, just inside the brush, not moving fast, just slow and steady, like it was tracking something. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, scanning the woods, heart starting to thump harder than it should have. Nothing came out. No more sounds. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a coyote. I'd seen signs of both. I went back inside, but I kept the rifle close, leaned up against the inside of the door. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I went out to check the area. There were no fresh prints, at least none I could see. But something was off about the ground near the back of the cabin. Some leaves were swept aside, a few broken sticks. There was also a dark patch of dirt that looked like it had been dug at, like someone had kicked it over with a boot. But I couldn't be sure. Later that afternoon, I hiked farther out into a thicker part of the woods. I followed one of the old logging paths, winding deeper and deeper, hoping to spot a buck or at least find signs of one. About half a mile in, I found what looked like an old hunting camp. It wasn't marked on the map Dan's cousin gave me, just an old fire pit surrounded by logs and a makeshift wooden structure that had mostly collapsed. Nearby, there was a pile of rusted cans, some bones, probably deer, and a tarp flapping from a low branch. I was staring at the pile when I noticed something strange. A set of boot prints. Not mine. They were deep and fresh, leading away from the old site and off into the brush. I followed them for about 30 yards before they vanished. The ground was firmer there. No snow or frost, just layers of leaves. But something didn't sit right. I stood there for a long time just listening. It was quiet, too quiet.
No birds, no rustling.
Just wind. I made my way back to the cabin before sunset. That night, the sounds came back, this time louder, more deliberate. I woke up just after midnight. I hadn't even fallen into deep sleep, just dozed off in my clothes with the fire still crackling. I sat up and heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside, heavy, slow, crunching over the frost-covered ground like someone wearing thick boots. I grabbed my rifle, walked to the window, and stood there in the dark, staring out. There was no light, just the moon cutting through the bare trees. The steps stopped. I stood frozen for what felt like 5 minutes, but it might have been less. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything else. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the window with the rifle on my lap, waiting. Nothing ever came. When the sun rose, I went out again. There were footprints, real ones this time, human, not just one or two, a whole trail of them. They circled the cabin twice, then veered off into the woods in the direction of the old logging trail I had followed the day before. I followed them again, this time with the rifle shouldered and my senses sharp. I kept stopping to listen, checking every side, expecting to hear breathing or see movement. After about half a mile, I found something that stopped me cold. A makeshift lean-to, not old and abandoned like the last one. New, sticks lashed together, plastic sheet as a roof. Inside it were empty food wrappers, a gas station receipt from 2 weeks ago, and a crushed water jug. There were 2 sleeping bags, one of them stuffed with clothes. Nearby, I saw a small fire ring and a torn backpack. Whoever had been staying there wasn't just passing through. I didn't touch anything. I backed away slowly and made my way back to the cabin, constantly looking behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and sat on the floor with my rifle ready. Around 2 a.m., I heard them again, this time more than one set of footsteps. At least 2 people. They didn't try to come in. They just walked around the cabin slowly, like they were letting me know they were still out there. In the morning, I didn't even make coffee. I packed everything into my truck, loaded the rifle into the cab, and got out of there before the frost had even melted. About a mile down the logging road, I passed a tree with a shredded piece of red cloth hanging from a low branch. It looked like a shirt sleeve. I didn't stop. I never reported it. I never went back. A few months later, Dan told me his cousin had gone up there in January and found the place broken into. The front window was smashed, and someone had started a fire inside the fireplace using torn-up pages from the cabin's old guest log. Whoever was out there knew that place better than I did. They'd been watching, maybe for days, maybe longer. I still think about it sometimes when I can't sleep. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't monsters. It was just people living out in those woods, surviving, hiding, watching. And that's what makes it worse, because you never hear them until they want you to. And by then, it's already too late. I had taken the week off from work to clear my head. After the stress of the last few months, deadlines piling up, my breakup in February, and the constant noise of city life in Spokane, I needed something quiet and far from anyone I knew. I booked a small off-grid cabin in northern Idaho through a site that listed remote properties owned by people who didn't mind renting them to people like me for cheap. This one was on the edge of Clearwater National Forest, about 2 hours from any major town, and another 30-minute drive down a dirt road full of potholes and tight turns surrounded by pines. The cabin was small, a single-room setup with a kitchenette, a wood stove, and a cot along the back wall. There was no electricity, no signal, and the only bathroom was a compost toilet in a shed about 15 feet behind the cabin. The woods around it were thick and quiet. You couldn't hear traffic. You couldn't hear anything but birds, squirrels, and wind. It felt like being cut off from the rest of the world, and that's exactly what I wanted. I arrived early on a Monday morning in late September. The air was already turning cool, and the sky had that grayish hue like it might drizzle, though it never really did. I unloaded my bag, some canned food, a small propane burner, and a cooler with ice packs that I knew would only last 3 days if I was lucky. I spent most of that first day stacking wood, organizing my gear, and walking a bit around the surrounding trees to get a sense of the area. Nothing strange happened the first night. I sat near the small fire pit outside, ate some beef stew out of a can, and read a book until it was too dark. Then I went inside, lit the oil lantern, and fell asleep with the sounds of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful, even though the silence took a bit of getting used to. I wasn't used to hearing my own heartbeat or the occasional rustling of a mouse inside the wall. The second day, I took a longer hike. I followed an old trail behind the cabin that didn't appear on any map, at least none that I downloaded. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Overgrown, fallen branches, no clear footprints or animal tracks. Still, I wanted to stretch my legs, and I had nothing but time. I hiked maybe 2 miles in, past some narrow streams, a patch of rotting birch logs, and even a collapsed treehouse-like structure that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. When I turned around to head back, I got this strange feeling. I couldn't explain it, but it was that odd sense like someone was watching you. I stood still for a moment, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything. No movement.
No chaps.
Nothing. But I couldn't shake that feeling the whole way back, like I was being followed at a distance. I didn't hear footsteps or snapping twigs, just a low, quiet tension that built up in the back of my neck and shoulders. Back at the cabin, I made some soup and tried to ignore it. I blamed the isolation, maybe a little paranoia from being so disconnected. But before going to sleep that night, I stepped outside to use the bathroom shed. That's when I saw something that didn't fit. A boot print in the dirt near the base of the steps leading up to the cabin. It was fresh, not like mine, which were already fading from the morning dew. It was deeper, newer, bigger than my own boot. I checked around to see if maybe I had stepped there and forgotten, but the tread didn't match. I was wearing a pair of light hiking boots I got from REI last spring. The tread on this one had a more pronounced heel pattern, something heavy-duty, like construction or logging boots. I stood there a while, flashlight scanning the trees, but again, nothing moved. The wind picked up a little and blew some pine needles down, but I couldn't see any shapes, no animals, no man, nothing. I went back inside, locked the door, and shoved one of the chairs under the knob even though I knew it wouldn't do much. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak and groan of the wood felt like footsteps. Every time a squirrel ran across the roof or leaves shifted outside, my heart kicked up. I kept telling myself it could have been an old print, maybe even from the owner of the cabin, but it felt off. I didn't remember seeing it earlier. By the third day, I didn't feel like exploring. I stayed close, chopped some wood, and just tried to enjoy the calm. Around the afternoon, I saw movement through the trees, far off, maybe 50 or 60 yards downhill to the east of the cabin. Just a flash of something dark. I froze and stared in that direction for almost 10 minutes. It didn't come back, but I kept feeling that pressure on the back of my neck again. I stayed inside most of the night. I didn't even go to the shed bathroom. I used a bottle. I kept the lantern low and moved the cot so I could lay with my head near the window, trying to watch the trees. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard something, a slow, steady crunch of leaves. Someone walking, not fast, just pacing, and not on the trail but close, maybe 20 feet from the back wall of the cabin. I didn't breathe for a full minute. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling. The walking stopped. Then I heard a faint tapping sound. Not knocking, just tapping like someone dragging a stick across the wall of the cabin. Then nothing. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave a day early. I packed my gear as fast as I could, tossed everything into the back of the SUV, didn't bother organizing. I did one final walk around the cabin to make sure I wasn't leaving anything. That's when I saw it. On the back wall of the cabin, just beneath the window I had slept under, there were marks in the wood. Scratches. Not from an animal. Not claw marks. These were made with a blade. You could see the edges were carved with purpose. 6 long vertical lines. Almost like someone had dragged the tip of a knife or something sharp against the wooden wall. Slowly and with pressure. No name, no message. Just 6 deep scratches, spaced unevenly, maybe a foot long each. I didn't report it. I didn't contact the cabin owner. I drove straight home. I spent the rest of that week in my apartment, curtains shut, phone on silent. I kept replaying that night in my head. The sound of walking, the tapping, the marks on the wall. I knew someone had been out there watching, maybe waiting. They hadn't tried to get inside, but they wanted me to know they were there. A few weeks later, I finally went back online and checked the listing for that cabin. It was still up, still available. I read through the reviews again, all 5 stars. People said it was peaceful, beautiful, great for hunting or riding. But then I noticed something odd in one review from the previous year. A woman had written, "Beautiful spot, but weird vibes at night. My husband swore he heard someone walking around outside. Thought it was a bear, but we didn't find tracks. Still, we left a day early." That confirmed what I needed to know. It wasn't just in my head. I'll never go back to a place that isolated again. The woods aren't haunted, but sometimes the people who hide in them are far worse. I hadn't been back to that cabin since early 2020, right before the divorce. Her name was Elaine. We were married for 15 years and things ended messy, like most things that drag on too long. After the papers were signed, she stayed in the city and I moved out to a small rental in northern Idaho, near Sandpoint, where I could live quiet and keep to myself. Elaine passed away last spring. Breast cancer. I heard through her cousin, who called me one morning, voice low and careful like I might explode. I didn't. I just thanked her and hung up. I hadn't seen Elaine in over 3 years, but that phone call pulled something loose in me. I couldn't stop thinking about that old cabin we bought together in 2011, the one deep in the woods near Boundary County. We'd used it mostly in the summers, fishing and chopping wood, eating canned chili and sleeping under wool blankets. After the divorce, she kept it. I didn't fight her on it. I didn't want it then. But now, I don't know. Something made me want to go back. Maybe I needed to see what was left. Maybe I needed to remind myself why we failed. Maybe I just needed silence. I took my old truck, filled the back with gear, canned food, bottled water, extra blankets, my .38 revolver, and a weathered green duffel with all the basic tools. The drive was 5 hours through winding back roads, past farms, into forests that got thicker the further north I went. I had to stop twice to check the map because the road signs were faded or missing. By the time I reached the turnoff for the trail that led to the cabin, it was already getting late. It wasn't a real road, just a pair of worn tire tracks through tall grass and trees. I parked 100 feet from the cabin. Trees had closed in tighter since I last saw it. Branches drooped over the roof. Pine needles blanketed the porch. The place looked smaller than I remembered, like it had shrunk in the years apart. I unlocked the door with the spare key from under a loose porch plank. Same as it ever was. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. The air was stale. Cobwebs stretched between beams, and the floor creaked under every step. I lit a kerosene lamp and walked through the room slowly, half expecting to find some trace of her. An old sweater, a book with a folded corner. But there was nothing. It was empty. Just a sagging mattress in the bedroom, 2 chairs at the kitchen table, and the wood stove in the corner, rusted and cold. I spent the first few hours sweeping, clearing out mouse droppings, and starting a fire in the stove. I unpacked a few things, made a sandwich, and drank half a beer while staring out the window. The forest out there looked heavier than I remembered. No wind, no birds, just thick, still trees. That night it rained. Not a drizzle, but a heavy, cold downpour. I laid on the mattress with my coat over me and listened to the rain slam against the metal roof. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to darkness and a sharp knocking sound outside. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. Rhythmic, like wood hitting wood. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The knocking stopped. The only light came from the embers in the stove, glowing faint orange. I stayed still for a long time, listening. Then I heard it again, 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, near the window. I got up, moved slowly across the creaky floor, and peeked out the window. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and rain. But I felt it then, this crawling unease in my chest, like I was being watched. I told myself it was probably a tree limb blowing in the wind, knocking against the siding. But there was no wind. Not a single branch moved. I sat up the rest of the night with the gun on the table beside me. Nothing else happened, just rain. By morning, everything looked normal again, like the forest hadn't moved all night. I told myself I was just paranoid. It was probably a deer or a raccoon. I stayed a second night, cleaned out the shed, stacked some old firewood that was still good, made coffee, tried to read, tried not to think about the noise. The next day, I went out further into the woods behind the cabin, where Elaine and I used to walk when we needed space from each other. The trail was overgrown, but I could still follow it. About a mile in, I saw something strange. A pile of stones, carefully stacked like a short pyramid. Not large, maybe 2 feet high. I didn't remember it being there before. Someone had placed a dead bird on top. A crow, maybe. Its wings were spread out like it had been posed. I stared at it for a long time. I turned back and walked faster than I should have. That night, I locked the door and propped a chair under the handle. I kept the fire going and kept the gun close. Again, sometime after midnight, I heard movement outside. Not just knocking this time, slow footsteps on the porch. The boards creaked under weight. Then silence. Then another step. I sat frozen, afraid to breathe. The fire flickered low. I waited, gripping the gun so tight my hand hurt. Then came a sound I'll never forget. The faint scraping of fingernails or something like it, along the outside wall, just beneath the window. It moved slowly, dragging across the boards. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no knocking, just gone. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. Bare feet, no shoes, adult-sized. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, where the window was. Then they vanished, like whoever made them walked backward into the woods and disappeared. I checked again. No tire tracks, no signs of a camp nearby, just those prints. I photographed them with my phone. I don't know why. I guess I needed proof, even if it was only for myself. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something in me didn't want to run. Maybe I was still chasing closure. Maybe I just needed to know what was out there. I stayed one more night. This time, I didn't light the fire. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark with the gun in my lap, staring at the front door. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. Slow steps on the porch. This time I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just sat there waiting. The door handle turned slightly. Not fast, not hard, just enough to test it. Then silence. I stayed frozen for hours. I never opened the door, never saw who it was. The first light, I stepped outside. The ground was wet from dew. The same bare footprints were there again. But this time, there were more of them, circling the cabin, stopping by each window, looping around to the back. like whoever it was had been watching, walking around while I sat inside. I packed my things without eating. I didn't even look back as I left. Drove down the trail faster than I should have. Didn't stop until I hit paved road. I never reported it. What would I even say? There's no crime in footsteps, no law against silence. But I never went back to that cabin again. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Could have been a drifter, a squatter, someone living out there. Could have been someone who knew Elaine, or hated her, or just liked creeping around old cabins. I'll never know, but I do know one thing. Some places hold on to what was left behind. Pain, anger, loneliness. That cabin had all of it soaked into its walls. I sold the property that fall. Didn't care what I got for it. Just wanted it gone. Now, when I think of Elaine, I don't picture her in that cabin anymore. I picture her far away from that place. Clean, quiet, peace. And I hope whoever is out there now finds something else to follow. Because I never left anything for them. And I never will. I don't remember the last time I felt fully relaxed. Maybe it was years ago, before my divorce, before the long hours started piling up at work, before I began losing touch with old friends. It was late October 2022 when I finally decided I needed to get away from everything and spend a week out in the woods alone. Just me, some food, a few books, my old journal, and no cell signal. No internet. No one else around. I'd found a small private cabin to rent way up in northwestern Pennsylvania, tucked away in the Allegheny forest. I'd never been there before, but it looked quiet and remote. Exactly what I wanted. The cabin sat about 5 miles down a rough dirt road off Route 666, past a worn wooden gate with a rusted chain that had already been cut, like someone had done it before and never fixed it. That should have been the first sign, but I didn't think much of it. I unlocked the place with the key left in a weathered lockbox nailed to the side of the porch, and it creaked open just like you'd imagine. It wasn't anything fancy. One room, wooden floors, a small wood stove in the corner, an old twin bed with a sun-faded quilt, and a few kitchen basics. The place smelled like dry pine and dust, which felt weirdly comforting at the time. The nearest town was almost an hour away. There was no electricity except for a small solar rig that powered a couple of light bulbs and a tiny refrigerator, but I mostly planned to cook on the propane stove or outside over a fire pit. I had brought in plenty of bottled water and canned food, plus some dry rations, a basic med kit, and my rifle. Not because I planned on hunting, I just always brought it when I went off-grid, just in case. That part of Pennsylvania has bears, coyotes, and who knows what else. The first couple of days were uneventful, which was what I wanted. I spent most of my time chopping small logs for the stove, hiking around, reading, and writing in a journal I hadn't touched in years. I even slept well the first 2 nights, but something about the third day felt a little different. It started that afternoon. I was a few hundred yards down the slope behind the cabin, checking out what looked like an old game trail that dipped through a patch of thick undergrowth. The air was damp, and the leaves had turned that deep orange and red color they get just before falling. It was dead silent out there, no wind, no birds, nothing. I crouched to look at some tracks that I couldn't quite figure out. Too big for a deer, but not shaped right for a bear, and then I heard something snap uphill behind me. A single, sharp crack of a branch. I stood up and waited, trying to spot movement, but there was nothing, just empty woods. I figured maybe it was just an animal that got spooked. I kept walking, maybe another half hour or so, but that feeling stayed with me, like I was being watched. I don't scare easily, but I had this pressure in my chest like something was off. I headed back to the cabin before sunset and locked the door behind me, even though I hadn't done that the first 2 nights. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing small noises, leaves rustling outside, maybe something brushing against the wall. A couple of times I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I peeked out through the tiny window, there was nothing. I didn't go out to check. I figured it was just wildlife passing by. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer sniffing around. In the morning, I went outside to get firewood and noticed something strange. The rocks I'd lined up around the fire pit had been moved. Not knocked over, moved. Like someone had dragged a couple of them a few feet away in a neat line. I thought back to the cut gate and started to wonder if someone else had been staying here recently. Maybe they were squatting out in the woods nearby. Maybe they didn't like me being there. I kept the rifle closer that day. I didn't do any more hiking. I stuck around the cabin and listened hard. The woods were still quiet, too quiet. I never realized how much you notice the silence until you're waiting for it to break. That evening, I cooked inside on the propane burner and didn't light a fire outside. I sat by the window after dark, watching. I didn't see anything at first, but around 9:30, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. Just a shape. No flashlight, no noise, just a dark figure moving slowly through the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a shadow, but it was walking upright. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the rifle beside me in bed, loaded. I thought about leaving in the morning, but it would still take time to pack up, and I didn't want to be out on the road if someone was messing around out there. I told myself I'd stay just one more night, one more day, then leave early the next morning. That final day was overcast. A dull gray hung over the woods like a lid. Around noon, I took a slow walk around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the tree line. That's when I found the cigarette butt. Fresh. It hadn't rained, and the filter was still clean, like it had been dropped there in the last day or two. I don't smoke. It wasn't mine. It sat right under the window by the bed, like someone had been standing there, listening, maybe watching through the glass. I didn't go inside after that. I backed up, watching the woods, and moved toward my truck. I figured I'd pack up and leave early, maybe spend the last few days at a motel. But when I unlocked the truck door, I found the glove box open and all my maps pulled out and scattered on the floorboard. I keep it locked. I always lock it. My chest tightened, and my hands started to shake. This wasn't just some animal outside anymore. Someone had been watching me, maybe even walking around while I was asleep, maybe while I was out hiking. I scanned the woods again but saw nothing, just endless trees. I jumped in, locked the doors, and waited, just waited. That night, I stayed awake in the dark cabin with the lights off, rifle across my lap. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard footsteps again. This time, I didn't peek through the window. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The steps were soft, slow, circling the cabin. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited, and then the door handle moved. Just a rattle, not a forceful push, just someone testing it. Then silence again. I waited until dawn, heart pounding the whole time. The moment the sun cracked through the trees, I packed everything in a rush and tossed it all in the truck bed. I didn't even clean the place or leave a note for the owner. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station almost 90 miles away, where I finally got signal again. I didn't tell the police. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin at night? That a cigarette butt and a few rocks got moved? There was no crime to report, but I never went back. I never even looked at the listing again. The strange thing is, after I got home, I looked up news stories from that part of Pennsylvania. Just curiosity, maybe hoping to find something to make it all make sense. There wasn't much. Just one story from a few years back about a missing hunter. Another about a couple who'd gone off-grid and were never found. Nothing conclusive. But one thing stuck with me. A local mentioned that people sometimes go live out there in the forest way off the grid. Not criminals, just folks who don't want to be found. And if you accidentally walk too close to where one of them's hiding, they don't always warn you. They just wait for you to leave. I don't know who was out there near that cabin, but I'm sure someone was. I felt them. I heard them. I saw the signs. And whoever it was, they wanted me gone. And it worked. I've never been back in the woods since. It was late October of 2019 when I took some time off work and decided to spend a few days up in a cabin I'd rented in the hills near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I was 34 at the time, tired of the office job I'd been doing for over a decade, and I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. No calls, no emails, no traffic. I found the place online, and it looked perfect. The listing said it was an old hunter's cabin, pretty remote, no neighbors in sight, no running water, but had solar power for lights and charging. It came with a small wood stove, a fire pit out back, and access to trails that led down toward a river. That sounded perfect to me. I drove out early on a Thursday morning, took a few back roads, and didn't see another person for a good half hour before I finally found the gravel turnoff the owner had described. The trail up to the cabin was narrow and muddy, winding between tall pine trees and thick brush. I had to go slow so I didn't bottom out the undercarriage of my truck. There were no signs, just a small blue flag tied to a tree that let me know I was on the right path. The deeper I got into the woods, the quieter it became. I turned off the radio. It felt wrong having music playing out there. The silence made it all feel more real. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood siding was faded and gray, but the structure looked solid. One small window in the front, a porch with a few steps, and an old metal chair tipped over to one side. There was a little woodshed out back, full of dry logs, and a narrow path that led into the trees. I didn't know where that path went, and I figured I'd check it out later once I unpacked and got settled in. Inside, the cabin was small and dark, with rough wooden walls and a creaky floor. There was one main room with a cot in the corner, a table and chair by the window, and the little wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A few old pots and pans hung from nails on the wall. It smelled like dust and old smoke. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 yards out past the tree-line. I unpacked my gear, started a small fire in the stove, and made some food. I brought simple stuff, canned chili, bread, trail mix, water. I'd also brought a rifle just in case. I didn't expect trouble, but being that far out with no cell service, it felt better to be safe. After eating, I walked around the property a bit. The air was cold and still, and I kept hearing little things. Sticks cracking, rustling up in the trees, but nothing ever showed itself. Just squirrels or birds, I figured. Still, I kept glancing back at the cabin every few minutes, just to be sure nothing had come up behind me. I don't know why. Maybe it was the silence. That first night, I couldn't sleep well. The cot was stiff and lumpy, and I kept waking up to small noises outside. The walls were thin, and every gust of wind sounded like footsteps in the brush. I knew it wasn't, but my mind ran with it anyway. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something bump against the back wall. Not loud, but heavy. I sat up in the dark, listening. It didn't happen again, but I stayed awake until the sun came up. The next day, I went exploring. I followed the narrow trail that led off from the woodshed. It ran downhill, cutting between the trees, and it went farther than I expected. I walked for about 40 minutes before I came to a small clearing with a rusted-out trailer half buried in weeds. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. One of the windows was broken. I didn't go inside. Something about it made me uneasy. I just stood there for a minute, then turned around and went back. That afternoon, while I was chopping wood behind the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were boot prints in the soft dirt near the side of the house. Not mine. Too big. Too deep. I walked over and studied them. The tread was different than my boots, and there were 4 distinct prints, like someone had walked up to the window and stood there. I didn't see any others leading away, which made no sense. It was just dirt and dead leaves. No concrete or gravel to hide tracks. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I even walked a circle around the cabin, rifle in hand. Nothing. I slept even worse that night. I kept the rifle close and the wood stove burning, but it didn't help. I woke up just after midnight and thought I saw a shadow pass across the window. There was no curtain, just glass. I stared at it, heart pounding. I didn't move. The shadow didn't return. I told myself it was just a tree branch or maybe smoke from the chimney. But when I got up in the morning, I walked around to the front window and there was a smudge on the glass. A smear like someone had leaned their hand or face against it. That was the day I decided to leave. I packed up my gear quickly, threw it all back in the truck, and went to check the woodshed one last time to make sure I hadn't left anything. When I opened the door, I froze. Inside, hanging from one of the nails above the firewood, was a dirty blue ball cap that hadn't been there before. I know it hadn't. It was old and faded with a logo I didn't recognize. It was also wet, like it had been left out in the rain. But it hadn't rained at all while I was there. I grabbed my axe and looked around again. Still no one in sight.
No buisses, no vehicles.
Just the trees and the sound of my own breathing. I slammed the woodshed door shut and went straight to the truck. As I got in and turned the key, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone step behind a tree just a little ways off the trail. I couldn't see any details, just the shape of a man, tall, thin, wearing something dark. I didn't get out. I drove, fast. I didn't stop until I hit the main road again, and even then I kept going another 10 miles before I pulled over. I sat there, hands shaking, trying to calm myself down. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone. Not really. I just said the place was too remote, too cold. I left a polite review, said it wasn't quite what I expected. I didn't want to explain the weird things. I didn't want to sound paranoid. A few weeks later, I went back to the listing, thinking maybe I'd imagined some of it and wanting to look at the photos again. But the listing was gone, removed.
No explanation.
Months passed. Winter came. I tried to forget about it. Then in early spring, I got a letter. No return address, just a plain envelope. Inside was a single photo, a picture of the cabin taken from the woods. The lights were on. In the window, you could see the outline of someone standing inside. It wasn't me. I hadn't left any lights on when I left. I burned the photo in my backyard fire pit, watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. I never went back. I never contacted the owner. I never found the trail again, no matter how many times I looked for it on maps. And sometimes, even now, if I leave my back porch light on too late, I get this feeling in my chest, like someone is standing just outside the circle of light, watching, just like I was watched. And I never, ever sleep with the window uncovered anymore. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything. My job had been burning me out, and ever since my divorce 2 years earlier, I had started spending more time alone. That fall, I figured I'd take a long weekend and head out to a small hunting cabin that my uncle left behind before he passed. It was in northern Idaho, out in Boundary County, near the Canadian border. Pretty remote. Not the kind of place anyone just stumbles across. No cell service, no neighbors, just thick pine forest in every direction. I brought my dog with me. Diesel was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, loyal, smart, protective. He'd been with me through everything. If there was anyone I trusted more than myself, it was him. He always seemed to pick up on things before I did. I packed food, a backup generator, some tools, my shotgun, and just enough to get by for a few days. I left town early Thursday morning and made the long drive up. The roads got rough near the end. especially the last few miles. Muddy ruts and overgrown brush slapping the sides of my truck. When I finally pulled up to the cabin around 3 p.m., the sky was already starting to gray over. Weather moves fast in the mountains. The cabin looked the same as I remembered it. One story, sagging porch with stove chimney, and a heavy steel door my uncle installed after some break-ins years ago. It had been maybe 6 years since I was last there, and nature hadn't been kind. A few shingles had fallen off, and part of the side wall looked warped from moisture. Still, it held up. I parked behind the cabin, pulled Diesel from the passenger seat, and gave him a good stretch. He was sniffing the air, tail wagging but low. Not excited, more alert. I got everything unloaded, lit the stove, and started cleaning up. The inside had gathered dust and cobwebs, but there was no sign of anyone else having been there. I checked the back door, windows, even the small crawl space under the floorboards. All clear. That first night went by quietly. Rain started around 10 p.m., steady but light, tapping on the tin roof in a calming way. I listened to it for a while before falling asleep in the small bedroom off the kitchen. Diesel slept by the door, ears twitching every now and then but never fully waking up. It was the second night when something started to feel off. I had spent the day clearing brush, fixing the gutters, and cutting dead branches away from the front steps. Around dusk, Diesel began acting strange. He stood near the tree line, staring into the woods without moving. His ears were pinned, and his tail was stiff. I looked, but I couldn't see anything, just dense pines and shadows. I called him back inside, and he came, but he kept glancing toward the trees all evening. He didn't eat much. Later that night, when the rain started again, he growled low while lying at the front door. I chalked it up to a deer or maybe a bear moving through the area. That wasn't uncommon. The forest was thick with wildlife. Still, I kept my shotgun next to the bed and left a lantern on in the kitchen. I didn't sleep as deeply that night. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to Diesel barking loud and sharp. It wasn't random barking. There was urgency in it, like he was warning something away. I sat up fast, heart pounding. He stood by the front window, hackles up, looking out into the dark. I grabbed the shotgun, slipped on boots, and opened the door. There was nothing, just rain and trees and night. I shined my flashlight in wide sweeps. Nothing moved. I stepped out on the porch, letting the beam trace through the woods, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, Diesel wouldn't relax. He didn't bark again, but he paced near the door for over an hour before finally lying back down. The next morning, I walked the property with him, looking for tracks. I found a few deer prints near the edge of the clearing, but that was it. No signs of people, no tools missing, nothing disturbed. But I noticed that a few of the trees near the back shed had fresh bark scraped off about chest height. Not claw marks, more like something rubbing hard against them. It looked almost like someone had used an axe blade to peel strips away, but there weren't any chips on the ground, just exposed wood. That night, things escalated. After making a small fire in the stove and eating a simple meal, I sat in the armchair near the back window, reading a book I brought. Diesel sat beside me, still tense. Around 11 p.m., I heard something outside. Not rain, not wind, something walking. Slow, deliberate steps moving past the sidewall. Diesel bolted to the door again, growling. I stood up, heart racing, grabbed the shotgun, and moved to the window. I couldn't see anything. I turned off the lamp to cut glare, looked again, nothing. But I felt it, that feeling you get when something is close and watching you. Diesel let out another growl, this time deeper, more serious. I stepped outside again, this time with my flashlight and shotgun ready. The rain had stopped, and the forest was dead quiet. Not even the usual chirps or rustling. I stepped off the porch, sweeping the beam in long, slow arcs. That's when I saw it. Not a person, not clearly anyway, but movement, just at the edge of the tree line between two thick pines. It was someone or something crouched low, just beyond the flashlight's edge. When the beam hit the spot, the shape dropped out of view, either ducking or falling back. My stomach dropped. I stayed there, frozen, for a few seconds. Then I backed slowly into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the shotgun on my lap and Diesel by my side. His ears perked and eyes locked on the front door. Around 3 a.m., I heard another sound. This one came from the back shed. It was faint, but it sounded like the door being moved, maybe pulled open or bumped. Then silence again. The first light, I went out there. The shed door was halfway open. I knew I had locked it the day before. Inside, I kept a spare fuel can, a rusted old lawn chair, and a few fishing poles. One of the chairs was knocked over, and the fuel can had been dragged to the doorway. Dragged, not lifted. It left a trail through the dirt. There were no boot prints, no paw prints, just a long smudge. I didn't wait. I packed everything by 9 a.m. Diesel stayed close to my side the entire time, never once wandering off or relaxing. I loaded the truck, locked the cabin behind me, and drove out. That bumpy road felt longer on the way back, and I kept checking the mirrors every few seconds. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I got a call from a neighbor who lived miles down the forest road. He told me someone had broken into their barn and taken some tools and cans of food. No footprints, no tire tracks, just missing things and clawed up trees nearby. He thought it might have been a drifter or some unstable guy living in the woods. I didn't say much, just thanked him for letting me know. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there near my cabin that night, but I know it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a ghost either. It was someone real, someone watching, someone who waited for night and rain to move in close. I still have Diesel. He's older now, slower, but every now and then, if we go walking in the woods near my home and he hears something off, his ears go up the same way they did that night. And every time that happens, I remember the cold rain, the flashlight beam cutting the dark, and that low, crouched shape just out of reach. I never saw it again, and I don't want to. I was 31 when I decided to leave the city for a while and build a small off-grid cabin in the backwoods of southern Kentucky. It was late September 2017, and I had just gotten out of a long, messy breakup. I needed distance from people, from noise, from everything. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I wanted to build something with my own hands, alone, and just stay quiet for a while. A friend of my uncle had a patch of unused land tucked deep in the hills near Monticello. It wasn't much, just a few forested acres that sloped into a shallow creek on one end and backed into a long abandoned logging road on the other. He hadn't set foot on it in over 10 years. Said I could stay and use the land as long as I respected it. I packed up my truck with what I could carry. A chainsaw, an axe, some tools, nails, a tarp, 2 big plastic bins full of dried food, a heavy-duty cooler, and my dog's ashes in a small tin. He'd passed away a year earlier. I didn't really plan on making a shrine or anything. I just didn't feel right leaving him behind in my apartment back in Louisville. The first 2 days were dry. I set up a temporary tarp lean-to near the creek and started clearing out a flat space among a cluster of maple and hickory trees. I picked a spot with natural wind cover and decent elevation so water wouldn't pool if it rained. I used the chainsaw to drop a few trees, bucked them into short logs, and stripped the bark. I wasn't doing anything fancy, just a simple 10 by 10 dry stack foundation using big stones and logs, with a frame nailed together out of smaller stuff. No insulation yet, no proper roof. I had the tarp stretched over one side as a makeshift cover, and I planned to lay the rest of the roof panels the next morning. That night, the weather shifted. It had been humid all day, but after sunset, The air started to feel heavier and cooler. The leaves stopped rustling. I remember thinking how quiet it had gotten. Too quiet. Then, just after midnight, it started raining. It wasn't a slow drizzle or a calm patter. It came down hard, like it had been waiting to dump for hours. Thick sheets of rain pounded the tarp, so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Thunder rolled in from the west, low and mean. The lightning was constant, flickering white flashes behind the trees like a broken strobe. Every few seconds, the woods lit up for a brief instant, then vanished into black again. I stayed under the tarp, wrapped in my sleeping bag with a rain jacket over my chest, but water was coming in from every direction. The creek, which had been slow and quiet earlier, started rushing. I could hear branches snapping. The wind kicked up and started dragging loose limbs across the forest floor. Some of them scraped the sides of my lean-to. One thick branch slammed into my tool bin and flipped it open. I had to crawl out and clamp it shut again with wet hands. Everything was soaked. I couldn't start a fire. My feet were freezing, and I was shaking inside my bag even with the jacket on. The worst part wasn't the rain. It was how dark it was between flashes of lightning. I don't mean ordinary night dark. I mean pitch black. I couldn't see my own hands. It messed with my head. I started thinking I could hear someone walking through the trees. At first, I told myself it was deer, but it didn't sound like deer. It sounded like slow footsteps, spread out, like someone moving with caution. But that didn't make sense. I was miles from the nearest house. Nobody knew I was here except my uncle's friend. I hadn't even turned on my phone in 2 days. Still, I kept hearing it. Crunch. Pause. Another crunch. Sometimes from the right. Sometimes behind me. I stayed low, motionless, listening. My tarp was flapping hard, so I had to tune it out and just focus. I held my breath for almost a minute at one point, but I didn't hear anything definite. Just the wind, the rain, the creek flooding a little. I told myself it was trees shifting from the wind. Then a branch snapped loud, very close. I grabbed my flashlight, but it was wet and flickering. I gave up trying to use it. My axe was beside me, still clean. I just held it across my chest and stayed frozen. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat there, damp and cold, trying not to panic. When the rain finally let up, the sky was just starting to lighten. Still gray, but no longer pitch black. I crawled out from under the tarp, everything stiff and aching. My clothes were heavy with water, and my fingers were wrinkled and numb. The ground was soaked and muddy, and some of my gear had floated a few feet from where I left it. I checked my food bins. One of the latches had come undone. Nothing looked stolen, just wet. That's when I noticed the tracks. Not boot prints, bare feet. Just a few, right near where the edge of the tarp had sagged. The prints were wide and flat with visible toes. Not huge like a joke, just normal-sized. Adult-sized. Not mine, I checked, and they didn't match. I wear boots. These were barefoot, and from the way they were spaced, whoever made them had been standing there, still, for a while. Watching. I felt cold in a different way when I saw that. A kind of slow dread that started in my stomach and crawled up my spine. I followed the tracks for about 15 feet before they faded into the mud and leaf litter. Whoever it was, they hadn't come from the logging road. They'd come from the woods, deeper in. I never saw more than those few prints, but that was enough. I didn't build the roof that day. I spent most of the morning checking the area, looking for more signs. I found 2 branches snapped at strange angles about 50 feet behind my tarp, but nothing else. No clothes, no gear, no trail. By noon, I packed up my food and hauled it up into a tree in a dry bag, just to be safe. That night, I stayed awake again. No rain this time, just dead quiet, and me sitting under the half-finished frame of my cabin with my axe. Every time a branch cracked or something shifted, I flinched, but nothing came. No more footsteps, no more prints. The next day, I started building again, but I moved the whole structure about 30 yards up the hill. I don't know why. It just felt better, safer. I built fast. I didn't bother with perfect cuts or level beams. I just wanted 4 walls and a roof, something with a door I could shut. I worked until my fingers blistered and bled. By day 4, I had it mostly framed and the roof sealed. That third night, it rained again. Lighter this time, and I had a real roof over my head. I stayed inside, dry, with my axe across my lap and a headlamp dimmed low. Nothing happened. I didn't hear anything strange.
No footsteps.
No broken branches. But even now, years later, I still remember how those prints looked. Clear, muddy, facing my tarp. Like someone had stood there, just past the edge of the light, watching me sleep in the rain. Waiting, not saying a word, not leaving anything behind. I finished the cabin eventually, stayed there for almost 3 months, then went back to Louisville and tried to settle back into regular life. I never saw another person the whole time I was there. Never heard anything again after that night. But I still think about those prints, how close they were, how still the person had to be, why they didn't make a sound, why they came barefoot in the cold and mud and didn't take anything. I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in people, and that's enough to keep me from ever sleeping under a tarp in the rain again. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a few days off work and drive up north, away from everything. I was 33 back then, living in Kansas City, working long hours at a local mechanic shop. I didn't really have much of a social life. I just wanted a break, some time away from people, from noise, from schedules. I didn't want hotels or crowds, so I found a small, off-the-map listing online for a cabin near a graveyard up in rural Iowa. It looked old, quiet, and most importantly, cheap. I booked 3 nights, packed up my truck, and left early on a Wednesday morning. It was a 5-hour drive through empty fields and winding country roads. The further I got, the more spread out everything became. Houses were miles apart. Sometimes I'd drive half an hour without seeing a single person. I didn't mind. That's what I wanted. The cabin sat behind a line of trees, barely visible from the road. I almost missed the turn-in because the wooden sign was so faded. I remember slowing down, double-checking the GPS, then pulling into a narrow dirt path. It wound through a thin patch of woods and finally opened up to a clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, just 1 floor with siding darkened from years of weather. There was a sagging porch and an old metal chair out front. To the side, maybe 100 feet out, was the graveyard. That part wasn't a surprise. The listing mentioned it. The pictures showed it too. Still, seeing it in person was different. The ground was uneven. The stones were old, chipped, many of them leaning or barely readable. Some looked like they hadn't been touched in 50 years. I unloaded my truck and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood and dust. There was one main room with a couch, a small kitchen in the corner, and a back room with a bed. No TV, no internet, no cell signal. That was fine. I was there to rest. The first night passed without much issue. I sat on the porch for a while after dinner and just listened to the sounds around me. Crickets, wind in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. The graveyard was still. I didn't feel anything strange. I actually slept better that night than I had in weeks. The second day, I woke up early and walked around the area. The woods were thin and the ground was soft from the rain the week before. I saw a few animal tracks, deer mostly. I stayed out until early afternoon, came back, had lunch, then read for a bit. As the sun started to go down, I noticed something strange. From the window near the kitchen, I could see the graveyard. One of the headstones that was straight the day before now looked crooked. I figured maybe it had always been that way and I just didn't notice. but it stuck in my mind. I walked over before it got dark. Sure enough, it was tilted at a different angle than the rest. I touched it. It wobbled like the ground underneath had shifted. There were no signs of digging, no fresh dirt, nothing like that. I told myself it was just age. Old stone, soft ground. That night, the wind picked up. I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. Something light, like tapping or scratching on the porch. Could have been a branch or some animal. I stayed in bed, listening. After a while, the sound stopped. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing on the porch.
No fallen branches.
But there were marks on the steps, small, smeared prints. Not shoe prints. They were too small, too uneven. Not animal either, at least not anything I recognized. They almost looked like barefoot tracks, but misshapen, like someone walked with a limp or dragging part of their foot. I checked the door. It was still locked. I circled the cabin. No broken windows, no signs of entry. I walked over to the graveyard again. That same headstone was now leaning further, and the ground in front of it looked different. Not fresh like someone had dug it, but softer, like the dirt had settled or been pressed down. I didn't know what to make of it. I kept telling myself it was the weather, maybe animals burrowing. Maybe I was overthinking it because I was alone. I tried to shake it off. That day was quiet. I didn't feel like hiking again, so I just stayed inside, read, and made dinner early. As it got dark, I sat by the window and watched the graveyard. It was colder that night, and the wind didn't stop. I kept looking at the leaning headstone. At one point, just after sunset, I saw something move. Just a quick shape, low to the ground, fast. I stood up, squinted through the glass, but it was gone. I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, scanned the yard and the graves. Nothing. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, checking the window, turning on the light. Around 4 a.m., I thought I heard something scraping along the outside wall. Not loud, just a faint dragging sound. It circled the cabin. I held still, barely breathing. It passed the bedroom window and moved along the side, toward the porch. Then it stopped. I didn't go back to sleep after that. When the sun finally came up, I walked around the cabin again. More smudges on the ground near the porch. No clear prints this time, just disturbed dirt. I looked out toward the graveyard and froze. The leaning headstone had fallen over completely. Not broken, just laid flat. In its place was a shallow impression, like something heavy had pushed up from beneath. The dirt around it was cracked and dry. I stood there for a long time, heart beating like a drum. I looked at the rest of the graveyard. Nothing else seemed touched. No animals, no people, no tools lying around. I walked back slowly. I packed that afternoon. I was supposed to stay one more night, but I couldn't. It didn't feel right anymore. Something about the grave, the strange sounds, the way the cabin felt colder. Not just temperature, but atmosphere. Like something had shifted. I felt watched. Before I left, I wrote a short note and left it on the table. Just in case. Something simple. My name, the date, that I'd stayed here, that I heard things, that I saw something near the grave. I got in my truck and drove without stopping. Didn't look in the mirrors, didn't slow down until I hit the main highway. I didn't sleep right for days after that. A couple weeks later, I tried to pull up the listing again. It was gone. The site said the host had removed the cabin. No contact info, no address saved in my history. It was like the whole thing had been taken offline. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Felt too strange. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I wasn't just imagining it. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was something human, something alive. Someone or something had been out there near those graves. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe something worse. I never went back, and I never will. It was early October of 2016 when I took the seasonal ranger job in the northern part of Idaho, near the edge of a dense section of forest close to the Canadian border. I was 32 then, still trying to figure out what direction my life was heading. The Park Service job seemed like the right mix of quiet and structure. I'd worked other ranger jobs before, mostly down south in Arizona and Nevada, but this one was different. It was more remote with fewer people, which I thought I'd enjoy. The cabin they gave me was about 8 miles off the main highway, down a narrow gravel road that twisted through the trees. It was old, built in the 70s, but solid. A single-room log cabin with a wood-burning stove, a desk, a small cot, and some shelves stocked with basic supplies. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and the radio could only reach the nearby ranger station 2 counties over. They said to check in twice a day, once in the morning, once before sundown. My job was simple: patrol the northern boundary trails, check for signs of illegal hunting, damaged wildlife cameras, or campers sneaking in past curfew. Nothing dramatic. The first couple of weeks went by quietly. It was colder than I expected, and the winds up there never really stopped. It whistled through the trees day and night. I didn't see many hikers or campers, just a few tracks here and there. One morning, on my regular patrol around the northwestern ridgeline, I found something strange. Someone had moved one of the wildlife trail cameras. Not just knocked it over or bumped it. Someone had actually unscrewed the mount and reattached it to a different tree about 30 feet away, facing the opposite direction. I figured maybe another ranger had adjusted it, but I was the only assigned ranger in that entire section of the park. I logged it, moved the camera back, and reported it that night. They just told me to keep an eye on it. 3 days later, I found it moved again. Same thing. Unmounted, relocated, aimed toward a narrow deer trail that barely showed up on the maps. I started feeling uneasy after that. Not because someone moved a camera, but because I couldn't figure out who would come out that far just to do it. That part of the forest wasn't open to the public, and it would take hours on foot just to get to that location from any of the nearby service roads. There were no tire tracks, no signs of recent campsites, nothing. Just that camera quietly moved and turned. I left it in the new position and marked the location. That night, a storm rolled in, and the wind got bad, branches thudding against the cabin roof, trees creaking loud enough to wake me more than once. The next morning, I skipped my usual long patrol and stuck to the inner loop closer to the cabin. That evening, I was going through the small stack of files they kept on the cabin's shelf, old patrol logs and trail maps, just passing time before check-in. That's when I found a worn manila folder tucked in the back labeled Unofficial, North Ridge. It was thin, just 3 pages, all handwritten by someone named Ellis Hart, a ranger from the late 90s. The first page was a rough sketch of that same deer trail where the camera had been moved. The second was a note that said, Motion cam number 4 moved again.
No footprints.
No signs of animals interfering. Recommend pulling cam until we know who's tampering. And the last page was just a list of dates and times, about 10 entries. All of them matched early mornings. Nothing else was written. No follow-up. No resolution. It made the back of my neck feel tight. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual before sunrise. I had a weird feeling in my gut. It wasn't fear exactly, just this kind of stillness that didn't make sense. I opened the cabin door and noticed something strange right away. The path that led from my cabin to the patrol trail had small indentations in the frost. At first I thought it was from deer, but when I crouched to look closer, it was definitely boots. Someone had walked up to my cabin in the night. I followed the prints about 30 feet before they disappeared into the brush. No clear trail, no sign of a vehicle, just footprints that came from deep in the woods and returned the same way. I didn't go on patrol that day. I stayed close, checked my radio, and kept the cabin locked. That night, I stacked wood against the inside of the door and slept with my flashlight in one hand. The next morning, I checked in late. No one responded on the radio, just static. I tried again in the afternoon and still nothing. I figured the storm the day before had knocked out the repeater tower. I made the decision to hike out to the nearest service road the next day, a little over 8 miles away. I packed light, carried my pistol just in case, and left early. But before I even reached the halfway point, I found something that stopped me cold. About 4 miles out, I saw a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There, in the middle of it, were the remains of an old tent, torn, collapsed, half covered in leaves. Near it was an old backpack, weather-faded and ripped open. I checked it. Inside were some rusted tools, wrappers, and a laminated ID badge for a ranger named Ellis Hart. No one ever said what happened to him. I turned back immediately, hiked hard and fast. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was dark. My flashlight flickered twice on the way back, and I had that crawling feeling again, like someone was watching from the woods, just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night, just sat on the cot, back against the wall, waiting for the sun to come up. At one point, I swore I heard crunching leaves outside. I didn't move, didn't look out the window. First light, I hiked out again, this time without stopping. Made it to the service road and waited over 3 hours before a passing utility truck spotted me and called the local ranger station. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask any more questions. When I filed the report about the backpack and badge, the supervisor just nodded like he already knew about it. They didn't ask for details. They didn't send anyone out. The whole thing got filed under unconfirmed. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was a poacher trying to scare me off, maybe someone living off the grid, maybe just a drifter. But someone kept moving those cameras. Someone kept walking up to the cabin in the night without leaving more than a trail of frost prints. And someone out there had Ellis Hart's ID badge in a ripped-up old backpack less than half a mile from the same trail he'd written about over 20 years ago. I quit park work for good after that. Got a job in a small warehouse in Central Oregon. Nothing exciting, just boxes and forklifts and lunch breaks. But sometimes, when it's real quiet and the wind rattles the doors, I still think about that forest. About the sound of footsteps in the frost, about the camera that never stayed put, and about how nobody at the ranger station seems surprised. I guess some places don't want you there, and some people disappear without ever making a sound. I was 28 that summer. I had just quit my job at a logistics company in northern Idaho. I was burnt out, tired of screens, routines, and people. I had saved enough to afford a break, so I decided to take some time off and travel a bit around the Northwest. I wanted to disconnect, no phone, no laptop, just the road and a few campgrounds. One morning in late July, I was driving south through a small, mostly empty town called Merlo. It was surrounded by thick forests and worn-down farmland. About 5 miles past the town, I noticed a dirt road that curved sharply off the main highway. It looked old and used, with tall weeds breaking through the gravel. There wasn't even a sign near it. Something about it made me stop. I pulled over, backed up, and stared at the path. I sat there for a while, engine running, looking at the road disappear into the trees. Then, without thinking too hard, I turned in and slowly drove down it. The road was rough, overgrown in some parts, and clearly hadn't been maintained in years. Branches scraped the sides of my old Subaru. I kept going, crawling slowly for about 10 minutes until the forest started to open up. That's when I saw the orchard. It was a large one, clearly abandoned. Rows of apple trees stretched far to the left and right, dry and gnarled, with branches heavy with small, rotting fruit. The ground below them was covered in leaves, flies, and soft spots of mud. I stopped the car and stepped out. The air smelled sweet and sour, like fermented fruit and old dirt. Everything was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling, no bugs buzzing around my head, just stillness. At the far end of the orchard, half covered by shadows, I saw a building. It was a cabin. The wood was dark and splintered. The roof sagged in the middle, and the porch looked like it would give in with one good stomp. But it was there, standing, tucked behind the trees like it had been forgotten for years. I walked slowly toward it. Each step felt weirdly loud on the dead leaves. As I got closer, I could see the windows had no glass, just empty holes with old wood frames. The door was shut, hanging crooked on one hinge. Part of the front steps had collapsed into the dirt, and there was moss growing along the bottom of the walls. I should have turned back. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I stepped onto the porch, testing the boards before putting my weight down. They creaked but held. I pushed the door open slowly. It made a loud, dragging noise against the floor inside. The smell hit me first: mildew, wet wood, and something else I couldn't place right away. The inside was dark, the only light coming through the empty windows. Dust floated in the air. There were 2 rooms, one larger main room and a smaller one off to the side that might have been a bedroom. The floor was covered in broken furniture, old cans, torn paper, and what looked like animal droppings. The ceiling sagged in some places with patches of exposed beams. In the corner of the main room, there was a pile of blankets and some empty food wrappers, newer than the rest of the trash. I froze when I saw them. Someone had been here recently, not years ago, maybe days, or even hours. My heart started to beat faster. I stepped back toward the door but didn't leave. I told myself it could have been a hiker or a homeless person passing through, but something about it didn't feel right. The blankets were bunched up in a way that looked like someone had just gotten out of them. They weren't even fully unfolded, like they left in a hurry. I moved quietly, checking the small bedroom next. The door was stuck at first, but I forced it open with a sharp push. It was even darker inside. The window was boarded up. There was an old metal bed frame with a thin, moldy mattress. On the floor next to it, I found a small bag half open. Inside were a few canned goods, a pocket knife, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a notebook. I picked it up and flipped through it. The pages were filled with uneven handwriting, short notes, and dates. Most of it was unreadable, either smeared or water damaged, but a few entries were still clear. One of them said ***. He was back last night. I waited for him to leave, heard him walking around the trees. He knows I'm in here. Another, I saw the truck again, same one as before. He parked by the trees and turned the lights off. Sat there for a long time. My skin went cold. I looked up quickly and listened. Still quiet, but now that silence felt heavy, like it was pushing down on me. I backed out of the room, notebook still in my hand, and looked through the cabin one more time. No signs of anyone else, no noise, no movement. I decided to leave. I didn't want to be there if someone came back. I stepped outside and walked fast toward my car. The orchard suddenly felt tighter, like the trees were leaning in more than before. I opened my car door and was about to get in when I noticed something new. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Not mine. These were wider, truck tires. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I froze. I scanned the orchard. No movement, no sound, just rotting apples and dry wind. But I didn't feel alone anymore. My eyes followed the tracks. They looped around the orchard, down past the far trees, and then vanished into the woods. I wasn't sure if they were coming in or going out, but they were fresh. The dirt was still loose at the edges. I got in and started the engine. I turned around as fast as I could on that narrow path. Took me longer than I wanted. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone come out of the woods. No one did, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It took me almost 20 minutes to get back to the main road. When I reached the highway, I didn't stop. I drove south for over an hour before I pulled over and tried to calm down. That night, I didn't sleep in the car. I booked a motel. I couldn't stop thinking about that notebook, the handwriting, the words. Asterisk, asterisk, he knows I'm in here. Asterisk, asterisk, and those blankets, freshly used. The tire tracks. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some cursed place. It was just a cabin. An old forgotten cabin behind an orchard. But someone had been living there, and someone else had been watching them, following them, maybe hunting them. I threw the notebook away the next morning. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I tried to look up anything about Merlot. I didn't find much. A few articles from years back about the town's decline, old farmland being abandoned, population dropping. But one thing stood out. A small report from 2016 about a missing woman. Her car had been found near a field close to Merlot. No signs of her. No follow-up articles. I didn't go back. I've never taken another dirt road without a sign since. And sometimes, I still think about the person who wrote in that notebook. Whether they made it out, or if the man in the truck finally found them. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was in late October of 2017. I had just ended a long-term relationship. I was burnt out from work, and I needed a change of environment. I'm originally from Illinois, but that year I flew out to New Mexico. A friend of mine had an uncle who owned a remote hunting cabin near the edge of the Carson National Forest, about 30 miles west of Taos. He barely used it anymore. I asked if I could stay there for a week or two, and he agreed without hesitation. Said there was no power, no running water, but it had a wood stove and a cot. That was enough for me. The cabin sat a few miles off a dusty service road. It was a single-room wooden structure with an old tin roof and a rusted propane tank outside that didn't work anymore. No cell signal, no noise from highways, nothing but trees and open sky. I parked my rental SUV a few hundred yards from the place and hiked in with my gear, basic camping stuff, food supplies, water jugs, a rifle, and a weather radio. The first few days were peaceful. I chopped wood, made coffee over the fire, and hiked around during the day. It was quiet out there, which was part of what I wanted. But by the fourth night, the silence started to feel a little too heavy. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in the suburbs or even on regular camping trips. This was different. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat and every shift of the wind in the trees feels sharp and strange. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I heard movement outside the cabin, like soft footsteps on dry grass. But every time I opened the door with my flashlight, nothing was there. The next morning, I found something weird. About 20 feet from the front steps, there were these small prints in the dirt. At first I thought they were coyote tracks, but they were too long and narrow, almost like human feet, but the proportions were wrong. They were barefoot, but the toes seemed longer than normal. I brushed it off as nothing, maybe just erosion or some warped animal prints, but it still stuck in my mind. I tried to stay focused that day. I hiked out toward an old fire road I'd seen on a topographic map. I didn't run into anyone, and I liked it that way. There were rumors around that area. Locals sometimes joked about skinwalkers and old curses, but I didn't believe in any of that. Still, the isolation made those kinds of things creep into your head. I started getting that feeling like I was being watched. You know when you're walking alone and you just feel like something's not right? That sense of something watching you from behind a tree or crouched behind a rock. That feeling stuck with me all the way back to the cabin. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The air got colder, and I felt uneasy. I heard what sounded like twigs snapping far off in the woods. Not constantly, just every so often. Sharp cracks that didn't seem random. It almost felt like someone circling the cabin at a distance, keeping just far enough away to stay hidden. I didn't go outside this time. I just sat there with the rifle across my lap, listening. Nothing came out of it, but I didn't sleep more than an hour. The next morning, I saw more prints. This time, they circled the entire cabin. They weren't dog prints or deer tracks or anything like that. They were those same barefoot impressions, long, narrow, and not right. One of them was close to the back window. Too close. I didn't know what to make of it. Could have been some local messing with me, or maybe someone was squatting in the area and trying to scare me off. I checked the perimeter for any signs, trash, gear, anything left behind, but found nothing. That afternoon, I debated packing up and leaving, but I'd driven all the way out here and still had 4 days of supplies left. I didn't want to be scared off by some idiot playing games, so I stayed. But I started carrying the rifle with me, even just to take a leak. I kept the firewood stacked higher, and I moved my cot away from the windows. I didn't play music or cook anything with strong smells that night. I just sat in the dark with a lantern and listened. Around 3 a.m., I heard scratching at the back wall. Not loud, just slow, soft scratches, like fingernails on wood. I held my breath. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I didn't move, didn't turn on the light, just sat there, heart pounding, staring at the wall. Then it happened again on the opposite side, near the front. Another slow scratch, then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I grabbed my gear and did a full sweep around the cabin. No signs of anyone, but the scratches were real. I found faint marks on both walls, fresh, like something with nails or claws had traced lines into the wood. That was enough. I decided I'd had it. I packed my stuff, loaded it into the SUV, and planned to leave after one more hike. I figured I'd go out to a nearby ridge I'd seen and get one last view before heading out. That was a mistake. About half a mile out, I saw something move in the trees ahead. At first I thought it was a deer, but it was upright, and it was fast, too fast. It moved low to the ground, but was definitely on 2 feet. I ducked behind a tree and tried to get a better look. Whatever it was, it stopped maybe 60 feet away, partially hidden behind a cedar trunk. It just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I swear it looked like a man. Only the posture was wrong, like he was hunched or twisted somehow. I raised the rifle, not to shoot, just to let whoever it was know I wasn't defenseless. The figure didn't move. Then it crouched, fast, and darted off into the brush without a sound. I stood there for a long time, waiting to hear footsteps or movement, but it was silent again. That awful kind of silence. I walked back to the cabin slowly, checking my sides constantly. When I got there, I tossed my last few things into the vehicle and got the hell out. Didn't even lock the place up. Drove straight to the nearest gas station, nearly 40 minutes away. I told the guy at the counter I thought someone was living off-grid out near the forest. He just shrugged and said, "People see weird stuff out there." I didn't push it. I didn't report anything. I didn't go back for any reason. I flew home a day later and never set foot in New Mexico again. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about that figure in the woods. The long footprints, the scratching. I don't know if it was a person trying to mess with me or someone living out there who wasn't quite right in the head. But I don't believe in skinwalkers. I don't believe in magic or monsters. Still, if you asked me today if I'd go back out to that cabin alone, I'd tell you no way in hell. Because sometimes people become the stories we're scared of. Not because they're supernatural, but because they're real and we can't explain them. And that's way worse. I was 33 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small wooden cabin up in Northumberland, near the border with Scotland. It was September 2019. The weather was starting to shift, and most of the tourists had already cleared out for the season. I'd rented the place online, not expecting much, just looking for peace and quiet. The photos showed a basic cabin with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a deck that looked out over a wide, empty valley. I'd been living in Newcastle for the past 5 years, working long hours in IT support, and I needed a break. I was mentally burned out and wanted to just be alone with my thoughts, away from everything and everyone. The cabin was about a 20-minute drive from the nearest village, and the road that led to it wasn't even paved. It turned into a muddy trail the last couple of miles. I had to slow down and edge around deep puddles and ruts. When I finally pulled up to the place, it looked even more remote than I expected. No other houses in sight, just grass, trees, and hills. No phone service either. The signal had dropped halfway through the drive and hadn't come back. The first 2 days were quiet and uneventful. I read, made simple meals, took long walks around the hills, and even chopped some firewood. It rained off and on, but I didn't mind. I had waterproof boots and a good jacket. The cabin was old but well built. The only noises at night were the wind or the occasional rustle in the bushes from a deer or a fox. It was on the third night that I noticed something strange. I'd gone for a walk earlier that evening, just before the sun started to set. I took a different path this time, one that led down into a small, tree-covered dip in the land. It looked like an old path, overgrown in some parts, barely a trail in others. As I walked, I found what looked like an old wooden fence, broken in places, leading toward what I thought was just more woodland. But tucked into the trees was an old structure. It wasn't a house exactly. It looked like it had once been a small barn or a storage shed. The roof had collapsed on one side. Moss was growing thick over the planks. There were no windows. I didn't go in. I just looked at it from about 10 feet away, then turned around and walked back. I didn't think much of it at the time. This was old farmland, and buildings like that were common in the countryside. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. Not because I was scared, just restless. Maybe I drank my tea too late, or maybe it was from all the walking. Around 2 a.m., I finally dozed off, only to wake up maybe an hour later. I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal this time. It was steady, deliberate footsteps, slow ones. I sat up in bed and stayed perfectly still. My window was cracked open for air, and I could hear the sound of twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was walking near the cabin. I didn't move for a full minute. I kept listening, but the sound faded. I looked at my watch. It was 3:19 a.m. I thought maybe it was someone passing through. A local farmer, maybe? But what kind of person walks around here at this hour? I stayed awake for another hour, just lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, I must have drifted off again. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. I didn't find much. A few faint footprints in the wet grass, maybe. Couldn't tell. The ground had soaked up most of the detail. I told myself it was probably nothing, but I decided not to take the same walk that day. I stuck close to the cabin just in case. On the 5th day, I saw her. I'd been sitting on the small deck behind the cabin, drinking coffee. It was about 11 in the morning. The sun had finally come out after 3 days of clouds. I was watching a pair of crows picking through the field when I noticed someone at the edge of the tree line, far off, maybe 100 meters away. A woman. She was standing completely still, just watching in my direction. I thought maybe she was a hiker or a local walking her dog, but there was no dog, and she wasn't dressed like someone out for a walk. She wore an old dark brown coat that went almost to her ankles. Her hair was long, tangled, and gray. From that distance, I couldn't see her face clearly, but she wasn't moving. I stood up slowly, not knowing what to do. She didn't wave. She didn't yell anything, just stood there. I turned and went inside. I waited by the window for a few minutes. When I looked again, she was gone. That afternoon, I walked around the edge of the clearing where I'd seen her. I didn't find anything.
No footprints.
No sign anyone had been there. The trees were thick beyond that point, and I wasn't in the mood to wander into them alone. The next night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I don't know why. I felt paranoid. I kept thinking about that old shed I'd seen earlier in the week and how it was just over the hill behind the cabin. I wondered if she had come from there, or maybe she lived nearby in one of the properties too far off to see. But even if that were true, why just stand there? Around midnight, I woke again. This time, I didn't hear anything. I just had the urge to look. I pulled the curtain back slowly and peered out into the night. There was a sliver of moonlight, just enough to make out shapes. That's when I saw her again, closer this time, standing maybe 10 or 15 feet from the front door. Her face was turned slightly, and I saw part of it in the moonlight. Pale skin, hollow cheeks. Her eyes looked wide, too wide, and she wasn't blinking. She just stood there. I didn't move. I stayed hidden behind the curtain, barely breathing. I watched her for what felt like 10 minutes. She didn't do anything, just stood still like before. Eventually, she turned and walked back into the trees. Her steps were slow and even. I stayed up until daylight. In the morning, I packed everything. I didn't even make breakfast. I loaded the car and drove straight out, bouncing hard over the muddy road until I hit the main lane back toward the village. I stopped at the petrol station and used their phone to call the letting agency. I told them I was checking out early. When they asked if everything was all right, I just said something came up. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how quiet she was, how she never spoke, never came any closer. But she knew I was there. She had to. And I don't know if she was trying to scare me or if that's just the way she was watching, waiting. A week later, I got curious. I went online and started reading about the area. I found an old forum where locals shared photos and stories about hiking trails and old ruins in Northumberland. One thread caught my eye. It was about an old shepherd's hut hidden in the woods near where I'd stayed. A few people had found it over the years. One user mentioned a weird woman they saw nearby in 2016. They described her as wearing a long brown coat and said she stood in silence while they passed by, just staring. They thought she might be squatting on the land. Another user replied that she might be the daughter of a farmer who lived up there years ago, but had gone strange after both her parents died. I never found anything official. No names, no records, just that thread buried deep online. I didn't report her. She didn't break in. She didn't threaten me, but I still think about her. The way she stared, the way she just appeared and disappeared without sound. I haven't gone back to the countryside since then, and I never will. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a murder story, but it was real, and that made it worse. It was late September 2017 when I decided to spend a few days at my uncle's old farm in rural Nebraska. I hadn't been back since I was a teenager. He passed away a couple of years earlier, and the land had been left untouched ever since. The cabin he built at the edge of the cornfield was still standing, though it looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were dusty, the roof sagging in the corners, and the screen door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. I was 31 at the time, tired of city life, and just wanted some peace and quiet. I thought I'd bring my camera, maybe get some shots of the landscape, and just disconnect for a few days. The place was a couple hours outside of Kearney, tucked down an old dirt road that split off from the highway, then narrowed to little more than 2 tire tracks through the brush. Once I passed the gate, it was just fields and silence. There was no cell service out there, and I didn't bring anything with me except a backpack with clothes, some canned food, water jugs, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. I parked my truck under the tree near the barn, grabbed my gear, and walked toward the cabin. The air smelled like dry dirt and old grass. The cornfield behind the cabin had grown wild, stalks way taller than they should have been, leaning heavy and yellow from lack of care. I unlocked the cabin door with the key my uncle had mailed me years ago, right before he died. It still worked. The inside was dusty but not trashed. There was a twin cot against one wall, a rusted propane stove, an old wood chair, and a table made from a slab of barn wood with saw marks still showing. The windows had no curtains, and there were just 2 light bulbs hanging from wires that didn't work anymore. I dropped my bag and opened every drawer and cabinet. Mouse droppings here and there, a few spider webs. Nothing alarming. I opened the window by the cot to let in some air, then stepped back outside to walk the property. Felt strange being there again, especially alone. My uncle used to tell me never to go near the silo at the back end of the field, but I figured he just didn't want me falling into it when I was younger. I wandered down past the barn and followed the edge of the cornfield. The air was still. No wind, no bird sounds, just the crackle of dry corn husks and my boots kicking up dust. I saw a rusted piece of metal sticking out of the dirt near the far fence line. It looked like an old pipe or something. I gave it a little tug, but it didn't budge. I left it alone. There was something about the silence out there that started to wear on me. I kept turning around, feeling like someone was behind me, but there was nothing, just corn and sky. That night, I lit a small fire in the pit outside the cabin and heated a can of chili. I sat on the step and watched the firelight flicker on the trees. No stars because of cloud cover. The moon was just a sliver. After a while, I put out the fire, locked the cabin door from the inside, and laid down on the cot. Creaked under my weight. I had trouble sleeping, partly because the mattress was stiff, but mostly because I kept hearing soft sounds outside. Not animal sounds, just small, sharp noises, like twigs snapping or dry leaves getting crushed. The second night was worse. I had spent the day clearing out some of the trail leading to the back part of the land. I found the old tool shed half covered in vines, padlocked shut. I thought about trying to break into it, but didn't want to get cut on the rust. By sunset, I was back at the cabin, sweaty and tired. I skipped the fire and just ate inside that night. Around 1 a.m., I woke up suddenly. My mouth was dry. I reached for my water jug, but froze when I heard footsteps right outside the wall behind me. Slow, steady, deliberate, not animal-like. These were human steps, crunching down on dead grass, coming around the side of the cabin. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was stopped just outside the window. I laid completely still. My ears felt like they were ringing, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps moved again, this time to the front door. They stopped. I waited, staring at the ceiling. I didn't have a weapon, just a small pocket knife in my backpack. After maybe 10 minutes, I couldn't hear anything anymore. I waited another 20 before sitting up slowly and grabbing my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I pressed my ear against the wall. Silence. I sat like that until the sun started to rise. When I stepped outside, there were no tracks, no broken grass, no sign anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. On the third day, I walked around the property again, this time taking my uncle's old crowbar from the barn. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I didn't want to be caught off guard again. I followed the corn rows to the far back corner of the field, past the tree line where I'd never been. That's when I found the second cabin. It wasn't visible from the road, or even from the main cabin. Hidden behind trees and brush, it looked like it had been built years ago. Smaller, made from darker wood, and with thick black plastic nailed over the windows. The door was slightly open, hanging on one hinge. My skin prickled the second I saw it. I walked closer, pushing the door gently. It creaked open, revealing a room with no furniture, just broken floorboards and piles of old clothes. Children's clothes, torn jackets, small shoes, even a lunchbox. I backed out slowly, heart racing. Who had built this? Why was it hidden here? My uncle had never mentioned a second cabin. I didn't step foot in it again. I turned and walked back to mine, faster than before, crowbar tight in my grip. That night, I didn't sleep. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard the sound again, this time from the back window. A single knock, just one. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding. I didn't move. 10 minutes passed. Then another knock, this one louder. It wasn't random. It was like someone was testing me, checking to see if I'd come out. I waited until dawn, then packed my things. When I opened the cabin door to leave, I noticed something in the dirt outside. A boot print, not mine. Someone had been standing there for a long time. I walked to my truck quickly, tossing everything into the back. I drove down the dirt path, tires spinning in the dry earth, and didn't look back. Later that week, after I returned home, I tried to look up any records about the land. There were no mentions of a second structure on the property, no permits, no photos, nothing. I called the county office pretending to be a potential buyer. They said the land had never been divided. Only one cabin, one barn, one shed. That was it. I never went back to that place. I never found out who was out there at night or what that second cabin was for. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. That farm wasn't empty, and someone still lives out there.